Craig Forman is the chief people scientist at Culture Amp, and every conversation I have had with him is like a triple shot of espresso. I leave feeling so excited about this conversation that's about to happen. But more than anything, I'm so inspired by how much he loves the people on his teams and the people in his life. And as a room full of people, I'm really excited to introduce you to Craig Forman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, very sweet. Will, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And it's been an honor. Thank you, everybody, for taking some time out of your day. I mean, I know I'm projecting that we're all very busy, and it's a lot to come out for a day, especially on a topic like this that's not the mainstream topic, and it's inspiring. I will share personally what drives me is my mission to help the world work better by improving the places we work. That's what drives me, and the truth is, I'm very fond of responsive, and I got on the phone with Willow and said, how can I help? And we started talking, and next thing I knew, we're running a panel on destigmatization of mental health issues in the workplace, which is awesome. But I also don't have a big background, particularly in that. I mean, I do have a background in organizational psychology, and I work with organizations. So we got off the phone, and I was like, oh my gosh, I guess we're doing this. But I also know that as it ties into my mission around, it's such an important topic, and the deeper I get into this world and this work, mental health and dealing with mental health, mental wealth, just being stronger in this realm is so important to improve our workplaces. But I also want to call out one of our values is courage to be vulnerable. And there's a lot I don't know about this. And I use this opportunity when we started meeting with the panelists and putting this together to learn. And I'm here today in this panel to continue learning and to learn together. So I wanted to first call that out, and I'm really excited to see where this goes. It's going to be interactive. It's also not going to be just a panel. I want to interact with the audience as well. So before we get started, another thing I want to share is that I want to call out the fact that I'm quite aware of my privilege. I'm quite aware that what you can see about me is I'm white, I'm a man. If you talk to me for 2 minutes, you get that I'm a straight man. And I know, and the more I learn, there's a lot I don't know. And I have blinders that come along with that. So I will also say afterwards today, or even during this conversation, I want to learn, I want to grow. If I miss something, please share that with me and help me learn, and we can learn together. But what I also know is there's things you don't know about me. And I think as we get into this conversation, we'll talk more about that and this idea of intersectionality. And I can share a lot of things, but there's a few I do want to share because I think it's relevant to today. One is there's been a lot of depression in my family. My grandma dealt with depression. My father was a Vietnam vet. He also dealt with depression and PTSD. So that's something growing up. There's been addiction in my family. And I lost a brother to drug addiction about 8 years ago. So another place that's touched me and my family when it comes to this issue. And the final one more about the workplace I want to share about me is that about a year ago, started doing some work with my younger daughter. She was challenged, like kind of getting out the door in the morning and getting distracted. And we started working on that, and we learned that she's dealing with ADHD. Wonderful learning about that. In that process, there was a moment in time I was learning about ADHD with her, and I'm in my 40s, the light bulb went off. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have ADHD. So I went and did some work and got assessed and was diagnosed with ADHD. I don't see it. I think I could go on a whole tangent about that. I don't see it as a disability. I don't see it as a problem. It opens a lot of doors and makes a lot of sense and helps me think about, like we're working with her to try to get accommodations in school, that all these years and thinking about the workplace and some of the challenges, and I never knew about it or how to ask for accommodations. So it's opened that door for me as well. So I wanted to share that as we're moving in to today and just kind of set the tone for us to kind of open this conversation. Now, I want to bring up our panelists, Emily and James. Thank you. And I'm going to let them, they're going to introduce themselves. So I'm not going to do a lot, but I want to call out a couple things about how this is going to work. One is we have Emily and we have James, and we also had Anthony. Anthony was going to join us, and just last night we realized there was a situation he wasn't able to be here. So that's unfortunate. And one of the things in getting to work with Anthony was that not only were we all talking about this idea of destigmatization, but Anthony really brought to the forefront the idea of the layer of underrepresented groups, people of color, that there's another layer that we can even add to this conversation. And I'm really sad that he's not here. But what I wanted to say is we're leaving a chair open in this conversation. And this chair open is for two things. I mean, we're going to do this regardless. Because during our conversation, we're not just the experts. I mean, there's a lot to learn here, but this is an interactive opportunity. If you feel you need to contribute something to this conversation, have something to say, this is your chair. But I also want to say I want to hold this some space and some energy for Anthony in this chair and for the conversation of underrepresented groups, people of color. That again, let's just call out what we see here, right? These are 3 white people up here talking about this, and we may miss stuff, and I want to make sure that there's space that we're not missing. So if you feel called, this is your conversation too. Please come up, take a seat, add something. Also, if you have a question, we can also interact just in the standard format. But I want you to understand what this chair is here for, and that I don't want this to be, and we don't want this to be just us up here pontificating, rather engaging. So with that, we're gonna get started. Yes, yes, it's not, yeah. Yeah. So thank you for giving me a few minutes to open up and share that. I'm still feeling a little inside, that vulnerability thing, but I appreciate it. So what I want to do is I want to open first by allowing the both of you to introduce yourselves. Yeah, I would like to hear a little bit about your background and why you're here on this panel, but I'd also like to know, is there something that we don't know about you, maybe as it relates to this topic or in general, to help us get to know you a little bit better, something we might not know by looking at you or talking to you for a moment. So I'll hand it over.
My name is James Pratt. I'm the VP of People at Gravity Payments. As I often tell people, if you've never heard of us, we're the company that pays everybody at least $70,000. Now you have heard of us. And I'm going to share this afternoon a significant portion of my story as it relates to mental health and mental illness. So I'm not going to do that now. Something you might not know about me is I can solve a Rubik's Cube in under 20 seconds. So that's useful. I'm also a... Yeah, it's completely useless talent. I am a bipolar recovering alcoholic, which we'll talk more about later on today.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? My name is Dr. Emily Anhalt. I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing for about 10 years, and I've specialized in working with people in tech. And recently, I have co-founded a company called Coa that is working to destigmatize and demystify quality, proactive mental health and emotional fitness. And so what our company does is we open brick and mortar therapy gyms, places where you can come see a therapist every week who we find for you. We match you to the right therapist. You can take workshops and classes on all kinds of things like resilience, mindfulness, communication, things like that. And it's all grounded in community. So rather than feeling like a really stuffy sort of, clinical place where no one's allowed to look each other in the eyes, we're trying to create a space where people can feel really proud and not alone in their pursuit of working on their emotional health. So that's the project we're working on right now. We also pair with a lot of companies that want to support the emotional health of its employees and make that easy to do. Something you don't know about me, I'm a fairly open book. I think that I've had sort of the privilege of having support to share a lot, and so I do that a lot. I also have ADHD. I did all of my doctoral research on ADHD and success without the use of medication, trying to frame it as a spectrum that everyone's on and that people need different accommodations about. And there, of course, is mental unwellness in my family, which is what led me to the profession that I'm doing today. But I really come from the place that we all exist on the spectrum of mental wellness to unwellness. And if we can kind of own our place on that spectrum, we're going to be in a better position to support people who are in other places on it.
Thank you, and I'm really honored both. I've had the opportunity to do some work with both of you, and to be here doing this again today is really such an honor. So we'll kick it off. I had the opportunity to speak with everybody beforehand and have a conversation, and I was talking to James, and we are talking about destigmatization, and we're talking about where we're going to go with this, and he said, hold on, Craig, hold on. What is stigma? Like, let's start there. If you ask 5 people, we might get 5 different responses as to what is stigma. So I wanted to start with that, but to hear from both of you on what your thoughts are on what is stigma before we talk about destigmatizing things. Like, what are we destigmatizing? So yeah, let's just start there. What is stigma to start with?
I think about stigma as othering. I think when we stigmatize something, it's often the very thing that we're not wanting to face in our own self. I believe the things that are most stigmatized in our society are the things that are most universal in our society. And at COA, we believe that stigma is change through experience. even more so than education, because we hold our beliefs really tight to ourselves. So it's a dangerous thing to just change our beliefs, actually, when we feel that they have kept us safe for so much of our life. And so when someone says something to you that's in contrast of your beliefs, it's pretty easy to discount it or to let it kind of slide off all of your protection and defenses. But when you experience something that is contrary to your belief, it's a little bit harder to deny it and a little easier to integrate it into your overall idea about things. And so having conversations like these, but also actually allowing yourself to be exposed to and interacting with and open-minded to ways of being that are different than what you're used to or different than the way you identify, I think that's what really actually changes stigma.
Yeah, I think kind of very similar that stigma is sort of labeling based on characteristics, attributes of somebody, and kind of making assumptions about like that person's capabilities, abilities, the way that person will behave or react to things. We've heard from a number of people here this morning who have shared issues with their mental health or mental illness, and in sharing those, some of us may have made some assumptions about those people that may or may not be correct.
And what about the experience of stigma for an individual, maybe from a clinical perspective, also just in your experience, James, of, what's the impact? What's the experience that an individual may feel when feeling stigmatized?
Yeah, I mean, I still feel an internal stigma. I was sharing this with somebody earlier. So with, bipolar, I can kind of run fast and slow a lot of the time. And I can get like super into something or like be really kind of responsive and engaged. And then I can disappear off the face of the planet, which I think I've probably done to Craig. I've probably done to some other people out there in the audience. And so like I end up kind of self-stigmatizing and self-labeling as like I'm unreliable, right? Like I don't deserve kind of someone like Craig's kind of like support to be involved in something like this because I didn't respond quickly to the email because I happened to be going through a kind of bad patch or a less focused patch. So that's kind of my personal experience of stigma. And I think to your point about being a straight white middle class man, I think it's easy for me to say to people, "Hey, I'm bipolar," and people see it as brave in some way, and I don't seem to suffer as much from the overt stigmatization, but I know that's not true for everybody, so I consider myself lucky in that respect.
I think feeling stigmatized is similar to feeling scapegoated. It's this idea that the things people don't want to kind of deal with, they find a place to put and convince themselves that if it just weren't for that thing, they would never have to face that feeling or that experience or whatever it might be. And so being on the other side of that is really painful because I think on some level you know that something's being put into you that doesn't actually belong to you and is being associated with things that aren't necessarily correlative. And so I think nobody wants to be told that there's something that they don't identify with, and yet we all do this. So again, I think my position is so much about normalizing that we've all been stigmatized and we've all been stigmatizers. And I think the first step to changing this is kind of owning our own part, the ways that we do it to ourselves and the ways that we do it to the people we love the most and the ways that we do it to people we don't know, and that all of this is kind of a way of trying to put distance between ourselves and some uncomfortable feeling or some unthinkable thought or some unknowable truth.
Yeah, and James, you said something, and I've had a few conversations as I've been thinking about this leading up, and I've heard this come up a couple times, so I'll ask the two of you, and this idea of self-stigma, like stigmatizing ourselves versus being stigmatized. Is there a difference? How should we think about that? This idea of like stigma, like how we internalize ourselves for ourselves, and then how the world may put on us. Or I just want to ask that question because it's been up for me. Right. If you don't, I don't want to.
I mean, I think I have something to say. What started coming out for me as you were talking was the I forget it was you. Somebody was talking about kind of the spectrum of kind of mental illness and dealing with ADHD without being medicated, for example, right? And I think that like we all have like there's a spectrum on which we all inhabit as it relates to mood, for example, right? In my case, my mood spectrum is broader than most people's, like significantly more broad, but there are people who have kind of narrower kind of mood spectrums. When you take something like bipolar and you put a label on it, it's like, okay, so now James is kind of like here on the spectrum. And, you know, sometimes I wish that, like, God, wouldn't it be great to be like not in the outer part of that spectrum, right? And that, you know, contributes to the labeling, because like I literally exist outside the curve, right? Like for most people, that's what makes me different. And, you know, again, I think that self-stigmatization is wishing that I could be, in inverted commas, normal, or the flip of that is trying to learn to accept that I just exist outside that kind of, you know, domain in one particular area, which is mood stability.
Thank you.
So I believe that the voice inside our own mind, the way we talk to ourselves, is such a mix of all of the ways we've been talked to over the course of our life and all of the ways we've observed people who we look up to talking to each other and talking to themselves. And so I almost would say something similar about stigma of ourself as I do of others, which that there's a scapegoating to it. I think sometimes when we stigmatize ourselves about something, it's this hope, this fantasy that if it weren't just for this one thing about us, then we would feel loved, then we would be successful, then it would be easy. And
are you the voice in my head? It sounds a bit like it.
Because wouldn't that be great if we could just get rid of one trait and then our life would be beautiful and perfect? And the truth of it is that life is painful and complicated and we don't get everything we need, and there's almost nothing that can prevent that. And I think there's almost something empowering about stepping into the agency of owning your own existential angst and pain of being a human, and forgiving yourself and having compassion about any particular trait, and kind of giving yourself permission to know that it's not that particular trait or weakness or struggle or whatever that is the cause of your pain and suffering. It's, you know, being human is pain and suffering. And if we can forgive ourselves in that, then it creates a little bit of room to welcome it as a part of ourselves instead of trying so hard to push it away and get rid of it.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. I will ask, introduce yourself, and there's one catch. Share something about yourself that we might not know when we meet you, and then please join the conversation and add to this.
That's a switch on that.
Can y'all hear me? Cool. I'm Andy. I'm Black. Just, you know, I'm just calling in. I was like, I'm gonna just come up here. My pronouns are she, her. I'm perfectly fine with they, them pronouns. I am extremely uncomfortable right now. I don't like talking in front of people at all. My energy, I was speaking to you earlier, my energy is just really low. But I love talking about trauma. It's really exciting to me. I like talking about mental health. I realized that I'm young. I don't have a college degree. I didn't finish. What people don't realize, I'm also autistic, high functioning, whatever that means. I think it's a superpower because I just was, right? Because I just kind of existed in this world realizing I'm really awesome. And I grew up in a family that just allowed me to be me. And I didn't really pay attention to anything outside of that. And then as I continued to interact with this world and society with the stigmas and everything place, I'm just like, I'm good. It's just, I think as a society just kind of outgrew can we cuss here?
Sure.
Okay, cool. We just kind of outgrew the bullshit. So I'm just like excited to be in this space with everyone and to have these conversations because these conversations will progress us as a society.
Thank you so much for coming up and sharing that with us. Did you have a question, or was that you wanted to come up and share that?
Hang here a while. Yeah, why not?
All right, you're in. Okay.
I feel like I check off some boxes. Yeah.
Awesome. Welcome.
So cynical.
Yeah, I'm from New York. I'm like have a sarcastic humor, so.
Got it. And also, hang out. And I also want other people to know that you can come up and swap out. We're gonna move. I have these three areas I want to hit on, but before we do, I want to go to the audience. Is there a question or two? Yeah, and I'm gonna ask you the same thing. I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself and share something we might not know about you.
Are you trying to not get questions, Craig?
It does usually works. Oh, by the way, you don't have to go crazy vulnerable. Just share something. It's okay.
My name is Sarah. I'm a recruiter. Something interesting about me, I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in Saudi Arabia. Then I lived in Pakistan. Now I live here. I speak a lot of languages. But something that I've been thinking about, and this is more of a general comment, you can feel free to elaborate on it if you want. But something that I feel like is missing from this conversation is I come from a really strict Muslim Pakistani background. And we were talking in the first group about how we have to fix ourselves before we can bring our best selves to work. And I feel like people of color come from a lot of communities that already have these stigmas about mental health. Like when I got into therapy this year, my parents made so much fun of me, which was funny to me. But I feel like, how do we destigmatize our personal communities and then bring that into our personal lives and then kind of bring that into the workplace? Is there a way to do that? It's very difficult.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any responses to that?
So I think it's really important when anyone identifies as part of a marginalized group of any kind to give yourself permission to either be the voice of education or to not be the voice of education, right? There are some people who are so traumatized by something that they really don't have the space to be helping other people understand how they should be interacted with or how they should be supported. And then there's other people who do feel that they have the space and resources to do that education. And I think it's important that those people empower themselves to do that so that the people who don't feel like they can do it don't have to. And so when I think about people who come from groups where therapy is marginalized, I think my invitation is if you feel safe in your community and family to be outspoken about being in therapy and talk about how helpful it's been and talk about why it's changed and what you've realized and how powerful it is, do that. Because again, stigmas change through experience. So those groups are going to start to have this other voice that's different than the one that's been passed down over and over again, that gives them a different idea. And likely they love and respect you and want to incorporate this other perspective into their ideas. But if you don't feel safe in your community to be that voice, you don't have to be. And you shouldn't feel like there's anything wrong not being. That's why therapy is confidential. That's why there is so much respect for keeping that private if that's what you want to do. And so to me, the invitation is to whatever extent you feel safe and comfortable speaking out differently against what's been told to you your whole life, do it, because that really will make change. I've seen it make change, right? One person who you love and respect saying something different than what you've heard, that's how groupthink is disrupted, a respected member saying something different. So I think that would be my encouragement.
I would like to add a specific example to that. So in 2013, my mum died of pancreatic cancer, and I was able to spend about last 6 months of her life in the UK, living kind of with or close to my mum and dad, just kind of with her, going to appointments and things like that. Now, the British are a very stoic breed. That unfortunately is not a myth. I think, my dad was born in the sort of rubble of the Second World War. His parents, saw their, neighbors, areas of town just get kind of bombed to rubble. And our response to that was to stiff upper lip and just get on with it. Get on with building our homes. Don't kind of complain and moan about it. And so, of course, generation that carries down. Because I live in the US, I had kind of got into therapy at some point prior to that. And as my mom was kind of, going, her health was deteriorating, I was going to see a therapist at the facility she was at. And I did it for a specific reason, which is I wanted to normalize for my dad the idea of going to talk to somebody about, grief and regrets and things like that. And my hope was that he would go before she died. He didn't, but he did go after. And so he got help. So a kind of example of I chose to stand up and say hey, going to therapy is not a big deal. I'm just talking to somebody about what's going on. And, I think it helped him process his grief. So yeah, that definitely works for
I
sure.
appreciate those stories. And, just to tie it back, as we're talking about the workplace, Emily, what you're saying is that somebody that you respect or care about changes the story, the impact it can have. And I couldn't help but think about leadership and executive leadership and how we can pattern shift, because we do some of that projection in the workplace on these people that we look up to. And then if we can get, the power of a leader saying, I'm going to be different, or what Shane was talking about earlier, of that power.
Yeah, when I'm trying to help people understand why they should get into therapy, I always talk about my experience as a patient instead of my experience as a therapist. It's a lot more powerful to show, like, hey, this actually worked for me. And because I'm a therapist, I have some language to put to why it works and what's actually happening in the room. But I think it's a lot more useful to talk about a personal experience versus trying to kind of psychoeducate people about things. And in the workplace, I think the same is true. A boss saying, hey, I really want you all to take care of your mental health is not as powerful as, hey, everyone, here's how I'm taking care of my mental health and what it looks like and how I can support you to do the same.
Got it. Thank you. So let's switch gears a little bit. And then the idea here is this flow of, first, what is stigma? And the second is, I thought it would be really good in our conversations to dig a little bit into how are we all being part of the problem before we talk about the solution. And like what I think one of you said earlier, the truth is this is really early days, and my sense is many of us have probably contributed. I mean, just the other day I was talking to somebody and they pointed out, like, when people use the word crazy at work, I mean, I've done it, and not thinking about who's around me and who that may stigmatize. So I'm sure, and that's a small example, so I'm sure I've been part.
I'm owning the word because I've been to the edge of madness, and so I feel quite comfortable, like, judging what crazy truly is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go with that. How are we part of the problem before we look at how we're part of the solution?
I feel like at time my silence is a part of the problem. So I'm a type of person that likes to always fix things and be a caretaker, and I overextend myself because I'm like, oh, I need to be the person, I need to be the voice, all that. And so at times I like feed into that, but I don't take care of myself. So just being patient and being like, okay, if I didn't say anything this time, it's okay. Then just kind of looking back and just being like, you know what can I do next time to improve? When I do see something, I don't like to call people out. I like to call them in. I'll be like, hey, it's a nah, don't do that. Or I like to pull them aside and just being like, hey, just so you know, that's not really the best thing. Because I like to be curious. I realize not everyone is as curious as me, or people lead with a lot of assumptions. So I just make notes of things. I'm like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but this is not really the language we use here, or this isn't with the values, or this isn't really the space to do that type of thing, because they may be going through something. We don't know that. So it's just always having those dialogues, having those conversations, but also checking in with myself that I'm like not overextending myself to have those conversations.
Mm. So staying silent is a way of being part of the problem.
I think the biggest way that I have been part of the problem and that we tend to be part of the problem is trying to fix other people instead of doing the work on ourselves. I think that if you want anything to change in your world, you have to start with you. You have to take responsibility for the ways in which you are unconsciously manifesting things to happen around you. And I think this desire to help others, though it comes from a beautiful place and we should have it, I think is often this kind of misplaced wish for this thing to be over there again instead of us. So my way of trying to fix that is owning that anything you feel about someone else tells you something about yourself, and anything you think is your job to fix about someone else, like, give them a little credit and a little agency that they can probably take care of themselves, and that really probably what they need from you is to own your own shit and do your own work and show up. And I think spaces at work will naturally become more safe for other people when each person is individually taking care of their own stuff instead of splattering it all over the people around them, which is what we tend to do. So the biggest step you can take to support other people around you, I think, is deciding that you're not going to deny the ways in which all of that stuff applies to you as well.
Be the change you want to see in the world. You said it so well. Thank you. This is wonderful.
I want to talk just for a second about stigma again to hopefully lead me into the answer to that question. So one of the things I think a lot about is why do people have such a hard time wrapping their head around the idea of mental illness, right? Like, why is the stigma kind of so deep in that area? And the way I think about it is that, So we'll compare and contrast physical and mental health, which is something, is done a lot. But if I break my arm, you can see it probably, right? And I've got a cast, right? If I'm having a kind of depressive meltdown inside my head, you can't see it, right? Maybe you see some symptoms of it. Maybe I look a bit kind of droopy or something, but you kind of can't see what's going on. So the second problem is that, so from the other person's perspective, if you've broken your arm before, you know what a broken arm feels like. If you haven't, you don't. Most people have felt sad before. So I'm going to use depression as an example. Most people have felt sadness and they've moved out of sadness. So their frame of reference is that, it's a transformable thing. You can be sad and then you can be not sad again. And so I think it's that people's experience tells them that the sadness is a transformable thing. The broken arm is something that you have to kind of, you have to wait out. So the second thing I think contributes to the stigma is, I think, a psychological thing. You can tell me if that's not the right way to say it, but if I'm observing a broken arm, I'm observing it as a third party, or I've got cancer or something like that. It's like an observable thing I'm kind of looking at. I can see a thing that's malfunctioning or a thing that's broken. Your brain is the seat of your consciousness. It's the thing through which everything you perceive comes. So if the thing that you're seeing stuff through is also the thing that is malfunctioning, that's like a massive paradox. And actually for me, in my worst depression or worst mania, that paradox is in full effect, right? Because, my view of the world is completely broken and distorted. So I think that's kind of that's part of the stigma. It's that it's just really hard to understand. Frankly, before I had a period of depression, I don't know I really understood it.
Yeah, I just to respond to that, I think what you're describing is almost mental health resilience privilege. And that privilege, I think...
Pray tell, what's mental health resilience privilege?
I feel like privilege is the assumption that something's not a real problem because you don't suffer the consequences of that problem. And I think that happens a lot with mental health, that if you don't understand truly the consequences of a particular mental health issue, you assume the consequences actually aren't that big of a deal or don't have that much of an effect. And I guess I want to simultaneously call it out and tell people that being part of the problem is partially about not having humility and making the assumption that if you don't understand something that it's not real, but also maybe some compassion that we all do this, that this is part of being human, that if we felt the weight of every problem in the world at once all the time, we couldn't function. And so out of self-protection and out of wanting people not to be in pain, we convince ourselves that maybe they're not, or that maybe it's fine, or that, out of fear of it becoming our problem to fix, or there's all these reasons we do this. And I feel like if we can simultaneously have some compassion for ourselves that we do this, but also humility about the fact that it's probably happening, and thus open-mindedness to maybe changing it, then we can move forward more easily.
And so to build off that point, I run a podcast called Silent Superheroes, which I'll talk about later, which gathers stories about people who work with a mental illness. And I had somebody coming on with body dysmorphic disorder, which is a kind of condition, as I now understand it, kind of an inability to see yourself kind of as you really are and to kind of find fault with your appearance. And I did exactly that thing. Before I went into the podcast, I was like, come on, this can't be a thing. Right? No, I mean, not quite that callously, but in the back of my head, I'd like to say a curiosity to find out about what it really was. But I know, in my heart, there was some judgment there. Because we all, have things we don't like about a body. Bing, I've done it. I've done exactly the same thing that people do to me. Right? So that's how we're part of the not having the humility, not having the compassion, etc. So extremely well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate that, the ownership, because I think it's an important piece of this. And the final question on this topic, and Emily, it came up in our conversation. It's a tricky question to ask, but I had this hit in our conversation, which is in most things, if it was easy to change or benefit us, we would. So what's in it for us societally? Why are we perpetuating this and making it uncomfortable? What do we have to go against? What do we have to give up to make a shift?
Because Andy's a superhero.
Yeah, right.
I'll apologize as well. I also am doing the throat thing. But my name's Lyra, and something that you might be able to guess if you look at my shoulders is that I'm in the circus. So I do lots of circus things like handstands and aerial professionally. I think what we're giving up by removing this this barrier between us and this othering is a sense of control, a sense that due to the just world fallacy, if we behave the way we should and we are a good person and we do all of our things, we take our multivitamin, this won't happen to us. And this is a fallacy, right? It's right in the title, but it gives us this illusion of control, this illusion that we can keep ourselves safe from this scary monster, because if we understand the problem, it could happen to us too. It's wrong, but I think that's what we're giving up.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Couldn't say it better myself. That's awesome.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it is the thing. I think one of the things that causes that judgment of, is it easier for me to live in a world where like it's your fault and your problem, or to believe that this might in some ways kind of malfunction or not be working quite the way I think it is? So
I definitely want to add that idea of control. It's like, it's not real. Like, like it's like, no. So just kind of just make simple choices, all that. Just to add also giving up just trauma. I'm like, I tell people it's just generations. I'm just trying to heal some ancestral trauma to make it a little easier for the next generation. Just share, just be compassionate, have love, and just share that, to just pass it on, so that carries on instead of the trauma that continues.
Thank you. Before I move, we have one in the back. I'll go back and.
Well, I'm Melissa. I was born in Nigeria, and I've been ruminating a lot on the intersection between mental health and activism. And you alluded to this in the beginning, that so many of the problems that exist, my own suffering as a queer woman of color, is because of society. And then people tell me to go to therapy, or they tell you to have confidence or executive presence when you walk into a boardroom. But part of the problem is we're solving this on an individual basis. And I'm not saying that's not necessary. We need therapy, we need coaching, we need mindfulness training. But we're not addressing the systemic problems that create these mental illnesses and conditions to begin with. And I am just, not to go too much on a tangent, but there was an article in The Guardian critiquing mindfulness and how it's been used as a tool for capitalism. And it's a tool that can be used to create well-being, to create mental health, but we're not actually addressing the larger issue, which is that we overwork people and that we don't create environments that are actually contributing to the well-being and full potential of individuals, and basically putting a Band-Aid on what's a larger systemic issue. And so even just the word mental health needs to be intersected with different forms of health. And so I'm not really sure what my question or comment is, but more, how do we create more of a social movement that comes with a very intersectional, systemic approach to the well-being of our humankind?
Right. Wow. Thank you. So well put. I appreciate that perspective.
I have a strong opinion on that. Like in my mental health advocacy, it takes a real toll. Like it's another thing that I have to do, another set of expectations that I have to meet, something where, you know, like, oh, I said I'll get an episode out, but like I'm in a depression and that's super hard and it's going to take me a like phenomenal effort to get that thing done. You know, it'll be twice as hard as it would be normally. And it suddenly occurred to me that like in the mental health space, it is absurd that the people who have the least emotional resources to stand up and advocate for themselves are the ones who have to advocate for themselves. And maybe this is no different than any other community having to advocate for itself. But I mean, somebody here as a trained, highly trained professional comes to it from the point of view of somebody who is, living with a particular condition. So like, I use this word under advisement, but like to me, it just seems like that's kind of madness that things would have to operate that way. But that's me speaking as an idealist. Like I realize that probably is how it has to work. But it's just a real pity that it's the people who it costs the most who have to stand up and not society more broadly.
I don't have a good answer because I think you've perfectly named the biggest problem of all of mental health is that everyone's trying to plug tiny holes of sort of this giant, malfunctioning ship. And I think you're right that it's even scapegoating to tell someone that to deal with their stuff, they should go to therapy rather than acknowledging the environment that they're in. One of the things that I think is that it's said often that mental illness runs in families, and that's true. But I think what's more true is that trauma runs in families, and it is trauma that's being passed down over and over from generation to generation, and that trauma causes mental illness, and that mental illness leads to trauma. And I think that this is true on a societal level as well, that these problems that are so endemic to our society are being passed from generation to generation, and that even though it's not fair to ask any one person to go deal with that trauma by themselves in therapy, I do believe that if we can get to a point where everyone is going and healing themselves from the unjust trauma that has been inflicted upon them by their families, by society, all of that, then they are in a slightly better position not to take that same trauma and infuse it into the societies that they're a part of, thus continuing the cycle. So I wish there was a better solution. I wish there was some kind of like societal wide therapeutic experience that we could have to heal it on a bigger level. But I think my little place of hope is that if we can spread this message that this is work everyone does have to do, that somehow if it can happen at the same time, it might be prevented from being passed down to the next generation of society. And maybe the next generation of society will be in a better position to treat each other with more care and more respect than the one that came before.
My psychiatrist has joked that adding a small amount of lithium to the water might help.
Who here is familiar with Raj Kumari and her work? I just want to call her in right now because this conversation, epigenetics and how trauma kind of passes through different generations. She's amazing, and I just keep thinking about her, so I want to call her into this conversation.
I'm just gonna add to the point. I'm like all about healing of the trauma, ancestral trauma, but I like to just make it into a conversation. Like these are all like taboo topics, so like, we shouldn't talk about this, all that. Like that's just like within 5 minutes, I'm like, hey, ancestral trauma, where you at in your healing? What's going on? It just like
That conversation every day.
yeah, right.
Okay.
So to me, everyone's so like siloed and we shouldn't talk about this or that. And I'm like, no, let's just talk about it. Let's do something about it. I like to be proactive, like, oh, it's a pity, it's this or that, it's sad. I'm like, y'all, like, listen, we're all gonna die. Like, we all know what's gonna happen. We might as well, while we're here, just talk about it, enjoy it, be present, and just go from there.
I think also a reason why it feels important that we're talking about it in this context around mental health at work is I have a pretty strong belief that the industry of tech is deciding a lot about our world. Like, because technology is becoming so widely spread, the people who are at the top of these companies are making decisions that are shaping society in really profound and ongoing ways. And so if the people who are starting these companies can be working on themselves and dealing with their biases and figuring out the ways in which they're making bad decisions, then that gets infused into the people who work with them, and that gets infused into the product that they're creating, and that gets infused to the people using those products. I think the same were true of politicians, for example, the people who are deciding laws. If they were dealing with their own shit, instead of using their power to play that out, it would affect other people in such a positive way. So I think my goal is like, let's try to get the people with power to do the work, because that will affect everyone positively.
I'm so happy you chose to join this panel.
Thank you.
Wow, gosh. Okay, we have a question. You know the drill.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. Something that you might not know about me is I was born and raised in Iowa. I moved to Boston, spent a decade there, and now I'm here. So my question is an actual question. I started an employee resource group at my office recently, and the whole point is to educate and destigmatize invisible issues. And in order to start this resource group, we had to go through HR, we had to go through legal, more than any other resource group that we have, because the information that people might share in that group is protected. And that we're really working on truly the honor system of, when people show up and if they want to self-disclose that they have bipolar or that they have PTSD, that there is the potential that if something gets out of that room and gets into, their manager, or maybe somebody who doesn't understand the conversation that's happening. One, I'm concerned about the psychological safety of that group breaking down, and then two, what do you think would be a good idea or a good place to start? Because we are dealing with legal issues when we talk about these things in the office, and there are certain things that you legally cannot ask, and the system is set up to protect, but also it can inhibit those conversations. What are some suggestions that you might have, or tools that we can take back to get the conversation started without having a lawsuit?
Great question, and it's maybe the elephant in the room that we need to talk about when it comes to the workplace, dealing with these and mitigating the fact that we're in a workplace and there are these legal issues around it as well.
I forget the exact words you used, but you declaratively said there are legal issues, and I would reframe it as there is legal advice that your lawyer has given on the interpretation of statute and law and things like that, and obviously your legal team are doing their best job to protect the company from risk. And I think the question is more about your company's tolerance for taking a leap and taking a chance and screwing something up, possibly screwing up somebody's job because something leaks back to somebody else. But it's you don't solve the problem by not talking about it. And if the thing you have to do is to take a risk to talk about it, then my view within the company I work at has been to talk about it.
Any other questions at this point? All right. You're going to have to share something else about you now. Yeah. One per question. Or comment.
I will. So, I unfortunately missed the psychological safety workshop, and I was on a call with my client at Amazon where it felt so counter to the environment that we're creating here and just a complete lack of safety on our call. And one, it's kind of a two-part question. One, when you are operating in the context of capitalism and shareholder-driven value organizations, even if your startup or tech company has a noble mission, ultimately it's about making profit. And so as their contractors, we don't feel like we can push back on our client to create safety because they're controlling our budget. But then too, just thinking about it in a small way where I was managing someone who had severe mental health issues. And for 7 months, we kept her on board, but she really just wasn't delivering on what we needed to do. And we ultimately had to let her go. And that was super heartbreaking. And I'm just wondering how people balance that. How do you balance being human with the bottom line?
Taking you on tour. You ask amazing questions.
I think that to me, this feels like a metaphor for all interactions, which is that compassion and boundaries are not mutually exclusive, that caring for someone and supporting them doesn't mean letting them do something that's not ultimately good for you and by extension the company. Just like if there's someone really toxic in your life, you can love them and have compassion for them and know they're doing their best and also have boundaries about how much what they're going through is affecting you at the exact same time. And I think sometimes people feel like they have to choose one or the other. And I think the same is true at work. I believe that we can support our employees with their struggles, give them resources to the best of our extent, and ultimately hold the boundaries of what needs to happen for a company to be successful. And I think it's a really tough balance, and where the line is drawn is different every time, and we're going to make mistakes for sure. But there's this idea that you're by having a boundary as an individual person or as a company, you are somehow being inherently insensitive or unloving. And I actually think the opposite is true. I think boundaries are an expression of self-love and self-respect, and finding a way to do it without further tearing down the other person, knowing that that person has agency and must ultimately be responsible for themselves without contributing to what they're going through. I don't know exactly how to do it every time, but I think that's the pursuit.
I think we're already, because we're moving into this final section here, and we're hitting on it, but I just want to call it in intentionally and really move this conversation, right? So we opened with what is stigma, then we moved into how are we all contributing, going a little darker on that, but like how are we playing in? And so I want to pull out of this now and say, now what? How do we move the needle? Which again, I think we're starting to do that, but I wanted to move the conversation to more, what can we do? How can we move our organizations? We have a question. Oh no, Shane, back here. All right, Shane.
Cool. Hopefully this is in rapport with the question you were asking. Okay, something you don't know about me, Shane Metcalf. I've drunk the Peruvian psychedelic vine ayahuasca over 60 times. And it's actually really shaped how I think about a lot of these topics and about how I've built some of the things in our company. Not everybody in my company knows that either. So my question for you is that, we haven't seen a lot of innovation in mental health and therapy. That, just because you go to therapy doesn't mean you're actually healing. There's a lot of very ineffective ways of trying to deal with trauma that don't actually deal with it. So, my reveal is kind of connected to my question, which is that, I'm really passionate about the emerging revolution of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, where we're seeing unprecedented levels of effectiveness. Guided MDMA therapy has a 90% cure rate for PTSD, for treatment-resistant PTSD with veterans. Johns Hopkins is doing all this research on psilocybin. So my question for you and anyone else in the room is, what are you seeing as the innovations that are happening that can actually really move us forward, that can create some quantum leaps so that in a generation or two, we are dealing with a very different picture of mental health where we have better tools to address this?
Bay Area in the house. Thank you, Shane.
Firstly, I support psychedelic assisted therapy. I have several patients who also take ketamine for treatment-resistant depression. It's made huge leaps and bounds. I'm in support of it. But I think I want to respectfully push against what I think is ultimately a universal desire for quick fixes. This idea of what is the thing that's going to make everything better in 2 generations, I think is a collusion with this defense we have that if something can't change right away, that it's not worth doing. And in my experience, the therapies that make the biggest change are not the new, shiny AI, whatever kind of things that claim to do things quickly. I think it's the permission, space, and commitment to doing the hard work, the uncomfortable work, the work that does take longer, that does make mistakes along the way. I think that's ultimately going to be our path. And I think there are innovations that are coming that are making that more possible. I think we can use technology and all kinds of things to enable and modernize the path. But I think ultimately the mechanism of change, to me, in therapy, is the relationship. And we're never going to be able to innovate love. We're never going to be able to innovate acceptance. What really makes it real is when you're experiencing it there in that moment and getting there. I think, that's what we have to innovate, is how to help a person get to that space. That being said, again, psychedelic therapy is not innovative. It's been happening for years and years and years in all kinds of native tribes, and we're kind of co-opting it and trying to figure out how to make a shit ton of money off it and have it happen in 2 sessions instead of 10 so that insurance will pay for it. And I just think there's a lot of danger of us trying to figure out how to make it happen now and quickly instead of kind of deciding together that we're going to be in the journey for the long haul and make small changes that will eventually get us to where we need to go. Does that make sense? It's fair? Okay.
I definitely agree with everything you're saying. When you brought up just indigenous tribes, it's interesting. It's innovation, what are we going to do to push forward? I'm like, just take a step back. All the medicines and tools, it's been happening. So just kind of getting back to our roots, to getting back to taking those medicines, being mindful. It's getting back to that point. That's really the thing that's going to lead and push us forward. Also, just access and resources. you know how hard it is to find a Black woman therapist in network? It is difficult. I found them, but it's just but just like it just those resources and having that connection, it's really access. That's another big thing, because a lot of these things are happening with mental health. Like, it's a privilege to be in this room. It's a privilege to have these type of conversations. Like, but then there's people going around not having the opportunity to talk about these things, to have these moments. So it's really just bridging that gap and making space.
Thank you. Wow, awesome question response. We're talking also, we moved into this now what, and one of the things that came up for me in our conversations around now what, I think is important in this conversation around accommodations. And James, you were a real model, because I wrote you at one point to schedule some time to meet with you, and you wrote back very straightforward, love to meet, so-and-so's copied here, I don't schedule well, she will. And, but I, knowing you and everything, I realized that you were just unabashedly saying, I have accommodations, I'm okay with that, I don't do this well, and you arrange something. So I wanted to call that out, but also talk about that, because even for me, looking at this ADHD and having to bring voice to accommodation, and I want to open that up. Let's talk about asking for accommodations, both individually and organizationally, how we can accommodate and start to move this in that way.
I mean, knowing what helps starts. Hang on. Did that come out right? Knowing what helps is a start. That's weird. Yeah, thank you. Because you can't ask for an accommodation until you know what you need to be accommodated. It's taken me a lot of years to figure out that, like, organizing a calendar literally drains the life out of me. Like, I will avoid scheduling meetings just so I don't have to go in there, whatever the tool is, and put a time on the calendar and figure out what room, and then all the people need to, like that's leaves me dead. But in this particular case, knowing that one of my colleagues, Chloe, is like a master of keeping that kind of stuff organized. And so I just asked her one day, I was like, hey, Chloe, like, is there any chance you could just help me do this? Because I think it'll give me energy to be able to do other things. And she's like, oh yeah, totally take that on for you. But then I bring all like the creative, destructive, thinking that terrifies her, right? All the kind of like mess and like, hey, let's do this like seemingly strange or odd thing, And so I think that accommodation is maybe finding it's a mutual accommodation. Like, by helping with this, I can also do that better. Maybe that speaks a little bit to some of the things I think you've been.
Yeah. And I do what you just said. I really appreciate too. And this bigger picture, I think so often organizations, everybody's looking at what people aren't doing well to one up and feel better, versus if we could shift to see, like, identify everybody's unique. Like I even said to you afterwards, like, oh, do you have an assistant that works on that? You're like, no, it's just a colleague that, like, I thought it was brilliant that you're just supporting each other, because there's things we can all bring to the table, and like, how do we leverage each other better? So.
Well, I'll give a concrete suggestion, since we've been kind of philosophical up till now, or I have at least. So one thing that we do at our company is called an emotional fitness survey. And it stems from the belief that it's often easier to ask for what you need before you actually need it. And it also operates under the idea that people have hopefully had some support and agency to figure out what it is that they need. And so the idea is, whenever we onboard a new employee or anyone we're going to be working with, we send them this survey with all of these questions for them to answer. They're all optional, so they don't have to answer anything they don't want to. But they're questions like, do you prefer to be praised in public or in private? Do you like to be managed closely or given space? Are you a person who wants to work at a desk, or should we make sure that there's a couch around? And we've just thought of all these questions that people can help us understand what it is that they need to do their best work. They can also edit it at any time over the course of their lifetime at the job. So we change, we need different things, and that's fine. But it's really useful, because then when something does go wrong or we need help, we have this information. So same with, like, what do you need when you're not feeling good? What do you need? Some people like space. Some people like company. Some people like food. Some people need the day off, whatever it might be. And so just having this information about people, not only do we have the information, but it also communicates to them that we believe that they have needs for accommodations and that we want to support those to the best of our ability. So think about creating an emotional fitness survey, the kinds of questions you would want your people to know about you and that you want to know about your people, and sending it out.
Yeah, if you need an idea on how to run a survey or where to go, come talk to me. Okay, this is our final question, because this is the end. So I'll ask this question, we'll answer it, and then we will wrap up. So here you go. One more thing about you, though.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Actually, this question and also comment ties into what you were just saying. So something that you might not know about me, I'm going to demonstrate some vulnerability. I have PTSD, and I was experiencing asking work for accommodations for a thing that I didn't even know how to manage myself. And something that happened with my manager, who I've already said I love, is that she did something really incredible. And she sat down and she's like, okay, how is this showing up for you? What are you impacted by? And I was like, honestly, every time somebody walks by, I'm jumping. Like, I can't focus because people are always walking by me and I'm the office manager. People have to be able to come up to me. And she said, what if we got you a rear view mirror for your desk? And it was just that sort of like out of the box suggestion that wasn't, like I had already read through the government's, list of reasonable accommodations. And I didn't, I could barely even keep my thoughts together at the time. And I didn't know what to ask for. And then I had that self-stigmatizing thought about like, oh, I'm a failure. I can't even do my job, and I couldn't help myself in that moment. And my manager did a really brilliant thing and helped me think through it. She didn't fix it for me, but she helped me think outside of the box because she was starting to understand what I was going through and could therefore empathize and help me try to figure out what would help me in that moment. So I think that maybe it's less of a question, but I would love to hear other out of the box accommodations, because since coming back from the leave that I was on, I've learned a lot about making accommodations requests, and I would love to hear other people's suggestions for that.
As we wrap, I'll open that up, because if anybody has just a quick thing that they've seen, like bring it, and anybody up here as well, and then this will be how we'll close out.
I guess I just want to quickly tag that from the story, it sounds like the most powerful thing was that this person cared enough about you to think with you, and even if she couldn't ultimately fix it, knowing that you're not in something alone, I think is usually more powerful than finding the answer. So I think that would be my suggestion, is being that person that's willing to sit with someone and listen and not feel like they have to find a solution immediately.
And one takeaway from that is that accommodations can be really simple. Right? And that was a, I don't know, $20, $10 fix or something like that, and that improved your working environment. And on that note, I could think of somebody I know who had a slightly larger divider installed on his desk. So he had ADHD. He was sat in a place where there was a lot of traffic going by, and so he got a little higher divider, and suddenly he wasn't distracted all the time by people going by. I know somebody else with ADHD who was put with a window to look out of versus looking kind of in to the office space. So again, he wasn't so much distracted by other people bobbing. This was a call center, like bobbing up and down and talking and things like that. So there are a couple that spring top of mind for me.
For me, many people don't know I have a speech impediment. I've been in speech class since I was like 5 or 6, but my mind just races really fast, especially when I get very passionate about things. So I'll just keep going and then my brain will just stop. So I have a thing with people I work with. I'm like, one moment, I'm overstimulated. I just communicate. I'm like, I just need a pause. And they're just like, okay. And they'll just wait. And it's okay. I don't feel like bad for like pausing or freaking out. I'm like, yeah, I just need to breathe real quick and be present. So just kind of leaving space and being flexible and open. That's really helpful.
I feel like we could go another hour. It's such a rich conversation. This is hopefully just the beginning of a conversation. This doesn't feel like a definitive endpoint for me. Andy, thank you for stepping up and sitting, and your courage to just be up here and lean into it. James, honor. If you're interested in anything of these topics, Silent Superheroes is your podcast. It's really a godsend. It's amazing and it helped me a lot. And Emily, I'm just so happy to have an opportunity to work with you again. You're brilliant, and I'm so excited about the work you're doing. And I feel like I'm just ready to watch this thing go crazy. So,
Greg,
thank you.
I want to add something. I want to thank Andy very specifically for something. So, I've been in like a bad spot lately, feeling very sorry for myself, like, kind of desperate. And something you said superpowers. Silent Superheroes is the podcast. You reminded me of why I got into mental health advocacy, because we do have superpowers. We are strong. Absolute dope as hell. And
my new podcast, Dope as Hell.
I'd lost touch with that, so you got me back in touch with that, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming up.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Craig.